Writing game directions. Creating games and activities can be a lot of fun. It can also be frustrating to play a new game that has unclear directions. Learning to write clear directions is a bit trickier than you may think. To begin, look at the instruction manual from some of your favorite games. Whether you're writing your game rules on a notepad, whiteboard, or printing in a pamphlet, take a look at how your favorite games format the instructions for inspiration and examples. Take notes of how other instructions are formatted. What comes first? What's next? When writing your own rules, try to follow a similar format. For example, some sections might be object of the game, parts and pieces, board setup, beginning play, winning the game. Make a checklist of sections to include that you see in other instruction books. You can use that as an example. Write your instructions to be read out loud. When you write the instructions and information of your game, assume that people will be reading them out loud. One person usually reads the instructions to the group. Write directions in short sentences and use the word players. Whether you're explaining the game that you created for the first time or someone else is explaining it with your rulebook, you want to make sure the words are quick and easy to understand. For example, if you have a board game about two countries at war, you might explain the objective like, you are a member of one of the two countries at war. You are assigned a role to help your country. The goal of the game is to work together to defeat the enemy country in one of three ways. You can win by destroying the enemy country through war, building an alliance, or being the first country to go into space. With simple descriptions and an active voice, you can easily get a good amount of information out. Players now know the objective and winning methods of the game. Use the second person. Instead of saying when a player or the player, try saying when you as much as possible. This will help you convey the rules of your game. The second person helps you when reading, as well as other players learning the game in the future. There are times when you don't have to use the second person. When describing what certain objects or tokens may do for a player, you can use the player if it makes more sense. To avoid situations where using the second person sounds awkward, remember to try and use active voice. Instead of the cards are shuffled, say you shuffle the cards. This active voice also gives the players strong direction of what to do. Make game terms easy to find and understand. When using a game term, such as a type of card, action, piece, etc., tell what it is right away. Keep it brief and to the point. For example, if you mention that one way to win is to build a coalition, state where you can find the instructions on how to do this. Add a separate section that explains this in more detail. If you have room, you can briefly explain the term before continuing on. Never include a term that new players won't understand without explaining it. Always show players where to find more information on the term. Explain the concept or goal of the game. Give your players a preview and overview of how the game works. You may even want to start with a brief summary of the game or the game world's history. It should be brief and help players understand the objective that follows. For example, if your game centers on warring countries, the summary will explain why the two countries are at war. They used to be a single country, but one part rebelled. Now, both countries are using all available resources to win. Write your instructions in order and in context. When actually writing your game instructions in which format you have chosen, do it in order. Writing in order means that you follow a logical path of explaining the mechanics of the game. You may want to start with a brief summary of the game, then include up at the top which pieces are included. Then, move on to the objective, the setup, how the play operates, and what each piece or character does. After explaining how you win, you may want to include more sections that deeper explain objects, moves, or player types you touched on earlier. Your instructions should work like a book or story. You start with a table of contents. After that, you may have a preface or foreword, something that outlines your game. This can be your objective. When explaining the rules and different parts of the game's flow, do it in the order that it'll happen. It should follow a beginning, middle, and end. You'll also want to include a brief section early on that details how many players can play and the age range. Explain the setup before you explain the start of play so players can set up the board. When the players finish reading about the setup, the next section should explain how to start playing. Following, you will have a style of play. For example, if you have a turn-based game, next explain how the turns work. If the turns lead to another action, you will next explain the action and components of that. Group similar information together. Make sure that there are sections of your game instructions that are easy to understand and follow. You should start explaining how to move on your turn, and then go on a tangent on which each possible outcome of every move is. Write your instructions so that players can understand how to play in the easiest way possible. Put all the ways to score points together. Explain the turns in one section. If you're explaining how a turn works, and then need to explain at the end of every turn a player draws one type of card, that's okay. You can even explain the types of cards the players may draw, but have a separate section that details what each card means and does. List and explain all objects in the game, individually and in depth. You may have already explained how some of your game's contents and objects work when detailing the game's rules and objectives. Use this section as an encyclopedia to further explain all objects. Go further in depth here than when you mentioned objects in earlier sections. It's crucial that the players understand what the cards, pieces, units, etc. represent. Consider drawing or sketching your pieces, even if this is just for fun, to serve as a visual aid. Separate the objects and group like ones together. Read over your game instructions. Wear the hat of someone who doesn't know anything about your game. Be honest with yourself and take notes of how well you would understand these instructions. Do you not explain the objective well enough? Are you using second person and active voice consistently? Do you understand how the setup, turns, and winning works? If there are trouble spots, make note of these areas and revise. Your instructions should be easy to understand so people can play the game as soon as possible. Show some examples. If your game has a turn-based structure or some format of turn-taking, show an example of how turns should go. This example should cover most, if not all, of the scenarios and interactions between the game elements, if possible. You may need to include multiple turns to fit all interactions. Use notions to explain this part of the game. Add a separate section that goes into further detail if needed. Consider including strategy tips. Sometimes the descriptions of the rules or how the board is set up can seem hard to understand. In order to avoid players becoming disinterested, help your players by including some tips on strategy. Include any extras or possible game variants at the end. All of the instructions and elements that you didn't cover before should be presented after the main instructions. If your game can be played alternate ways, list the alternate ways here. The main instructions help the operation of the game. If your game includes other elements that aren't used specifically for the main game, take the time to explain those here. Format your pages so that people can easily read the instructions. No matter where you're writing your instructions or how you'll present the final ones, make sure that your pages or documents are easy to read. Formatting includes the layout and order of the instructions, but it also includes the kind of font and spacing you include. If you are typing, don't pick a crazy font that's hard to read. If you're handwriting, write legibly. Don't clump all of your instructions into block paragraphs. Use bullet points when you can. Break up the text with a visual aid if possible. Have someone read over your game instructions. Get a second pair of eyes to read your instructions and check for any errors. This person can also tell you if your instructions make sense and where to better explain things. Finally, give your game with the directions to a group of players and let them try it out. Clear directions make games super fun.